She said he told her he was not married. She said they had a romantic relationship, and when she finally understood what had happened, she looked into a camera and told the world she was sorry for Laci's family. That moment, those words, cut through years of legal proceedings, media coverage, and courtroom arguments in a way that nothing else could. Because buried inside that apology was something the entire country had already been asking. If Scott Peterson was willing to deceive the woman he was seeing, what else was he willing to do? In 2026, that question has taken on an entirely different dimension. The trial is long over. The verdict has stood for more than 2 decades. The death sentence has been removed and replaced. And Scott Peterson is no longer living in the isolated conditions of California's death row. He is living among the general prison population, in a facility where his name is known by virtually every person who walks those corridors. The sentence changed. The walls did not. Today, we are going back to the beginning of one of the most documented criminal cases in modern American history. We are tracing every significant moment, from a Christmas Eve disappearance in Modesto, California, through a trial that captivated the entire nation, through a death sentence, through a resentencing, and into the prison reality that exists right now. If you appreciate true crime investigations that are built on documented facts and presented with full context, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to DAV Crime Records so you never miss another story like this one. Now let us go back to December of 2002. Laci Peterson was 27 years old. She lived with her husband, Scott Peterson, in a home on Covina Avenue in Modesto, California. By every account available from those who knew her, she was warm, energetic, and deeply excited about the life she was building. She had studied ornamental horticulture at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo. She loved cooking, loved entertaining, and loved the people around her. Friends described her as someone who made every room feel brighter simply by being in it. In December of 2002, she was 8 months pregnant. The baby was a boy. She and Scott had already chosen a name. They were going to call him Connor. The nursery had been prepared. The due date was February 10th, 2003. By every outward measure, Laci Peterson was living exactly the life she had hoped for. Christmas Eve morning began the way mornings did in that household. According to the account Scott Peterson later gave investigators, Laci was awake and watching television when he left the house. He said she had been watching a program. He said he was heading out to go fishing. His destination, he told authorities, was the Berkeley Marina, located along San Francisco Bay, a drive of approximately 90 miles from Modesto. He returned home that afternoon. The house was empty. The couple's golden retriever, a dog named Mackenzie, was in the backyard with his leash still attached. Laci was not there. Scott called Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, that evening. Sharon contacted police immediately. By the end of that night, a missing persons report had been filed, and the search for Laci Peterson had begun. What followed in the hours and days after that report was filed was a community coming together under the weight of something no one wanted to believe. Neighbors, volunteers, family members, and law enforcement began searching. News organizations picked up the story. Within days, the case had moved beyond local coverage and was drawing attention from across California and then across the country. There was still hope in those early days. Many people held on to the belief that Laci would be found safely. That hope would not last. From nearly the beginning of the investigation, certain details stood out to those examining the case. The fishing trip itself drew scrutiny. Scott Peterson had purchased his boat, a 14-foot aluminum vessel, on December 9, 2002. That was just 15 days before Christmas Eve, just 15 days before Laci disappeared. He had taken the boat out only once before that day. The Berkeley Marina, the location he identified as his fishing destination, was not a nearby neighborhood spot. It required a deliberate journey of nearly 90 miles from their Modesto home, and critically, investigators would later note that he had not mentioned the trip to family members or neighbors before he left that morning. There was also the matter of the dog. Neighbors in the area reported seeing Mackenzie wandering the neighborhood earlier that Christmas Eve day, leash still dragging behind him, without Laci nearby. That detail conflicted with the picture Scott had painted of his wife being home and well when he departed. Investigators took note. As the search continued and public attention expanded, law enforcement was simultaneously working through a development that had not yet been made public. Authorities learned that Scott Peterson had been involved in a romantic relationship with a woman from Fresno, California. Her name was Amber Frey. She was a massage therapist. She had been introduced to Scott through a mutual friend in November of 2002, just weeks before Laci vanished. According to court records and Frey's own later testimony, Scott Peterson had presented himself to her as a single man. He told her he was not married. He did not tell her that his wife was pregnant and expecting their first child within weeks. The relationship between Scott and Amber Frey had become intimate during those weeks in late 2002. When Laci Peterson disappeared on Christmas Eve and the story erupted across national news broadcasts, Amber Frey saw Scott Peterson's face on her television screen. She recognized him immediately. She understood in that moment that the man she had been involved with was the husband of a missing pregnant woman. She contacted the Modesto Police Department. That decision by Amber Frey would prove to be one of the most consequential developments in the entire investigation. Working with law enforcement, she continued to communicate with Scott Peterson through recorded telephone calls over the weeks that followed. Investigators monitored and documented those conversations. What those recordings captured would eventually become central to the public's understanding of who Scott Peterson was during those critical weeks. The New Year's Eve calls received particular attention, as Laci's family and friends held vigils, as search teams combed through areas of Modesto and beyond, as news organizations broadcast appeals for information. Scott Peterson was on the phone with Amber Frey. During those conversations, he described himself as calling from Paris. He spoke about celebrations near the Eiffel Tower. He constructed a picture of himself in France, ringing in the new year far from California. He was not in Paris. He was not in France. Investigators confirmed he had not traveled internationally. He was in California, speaking to a woman he had deceived about his entire life, while his pregnant wife was missing, and her family was publicly begging for anyone with information to come forward. The contrast between those two simultaneous realities, the grieving family searching for Laci and the recorded phone calls, would later become one of the most discussed and most disturbing elements of the entire case. Months passed. January became February. February became March. The investigation continued. The search expanded. Media coverage intensified to a degree that few missing persons cases in American history had ever seen. And still, Laci Peterson had not been found. Then came April of 2003. On April 13th, the partial remains of a male fetus were discovered along the rocky shoreline near the Richmond area of Contra Costa County, along San Francisco Bay. The following day, on April 14th, the partial remains of a female body were found nearby. DNA analysis would confirm what investigators feared. The remains were those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The location was not coincidental in the eyes of investigators. The remains had surfaced in the same bay Scott Peterson identified as his fishing destination on the day Laci disappeared. That geographic connection became one of the most examined elements of the entire case. The medical examiner was unable to establish a precise cause of death due to the condition of the remains after months in the water. But the identification was certain. Laci Peterson was gone. Connor Peterson, who had never drawn a breath outside his mother, was gone. The case was now a homicide investigation. On April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested. The arrest did not take place in Modesto. It did not take place anywhere near the family home or the community where Laci had lived. Scott Peterson was taken into custody in La Jolla, a coastal community in San Diego County, hundreds of miles from Modesto. The details surrounding the arrest received extensive documentation and media coverage. Peterson's hair and beard had been colored blonde, noticeably different from his appearance in prior public photographs. He was carrying approximately $15,000 in cash. He had multiple cell phones in his possession. He was in possession of identification belonging to his brother. His vehicle contained camping gear and additional clothing. Prosecutors would later argue that the totality of those circumstances reflected an awareness of guilt and a preparation for flight. Defense attorneys disputed that interpretation entirely, arguing the details were the result of an individual under extreme personal and media pressure, not a man attempting to flee accountability. The legal proceedings that followed would stretch across more than a year before the case went to a jury. Because of the extraordinary level of pretrial publicity throughout the Central Valley and across California, the trial was moved to Redwood City in San Mateo County. When proceedings formally began in 2004, the case had already become one of the most recognized criminal matters in the country. News organizations assigned dedicated teams. Legal analysts appeared on television daily. The public followed every development with an intensity that had rarely been seen outside of a handful of defining cases in American legal history. The prosecution built its case without a murder weapon. There was no confession from Scott Peterson. There was no witness who claimed to have seen the crime occur. The case that prosecutors presented to the jury was built on circumstantial evidence, meaning the argument that when all known facts were considered together, they pointed conclusively toward guilt. Prosecutors walked the jury through Peterson's relationship with Amber Frey. They played the recorded telephone calls in open court. They presented evidence of his activities in the period surrounding Laci's disappearance. They introduced evidence that Peterson had conducted online research into tides and currents in San Francisco Bay prior to that Christmas Eve. They detailed the boat purchase made just weeks before Laci vanished. They presented financial records and insurance documentation. They argued that when every piece was assembled, the picture was clear. The defense challenged the investigation at every point. Defense attorneys argued that the evidence gathering had been flawed and that critical leads pointing toward alternative suspects had not been adequately pursued. They raised the possibility that Laci had been the victim of a third-party abduction, referencing a reported burglary that had occurred in the neighborhood on Christmas Eve morning. They maintained that the circumstantial nature of the prosecution's case did not reach the legal threshold of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Amber Frey took the stand during the trial. She testified about the nature of her relationship with Scott Peterson, about the lies he had told her, and about her decision to cooperate with investigators. The recorded calls were played for the jury. Every word Peterson had spoken during those weeks, including the fabricated Paris celebrations, was heard in that courtroom. After months of testimony, witness accounts, expert presentations, and legal arguments, the case moved to the jury. On November 12, 2004, the verdict was delivered. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci Peterson. He was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Connor Peterson. The first-degree finding reflected the jury's conclusion that the killing of Laci was deliberate and premeditated. The second-degree finding addressed Connor's death under California's fetal homicide statute. For Laci's family, for Sharon Rocha, for Brent Rocha, for the people who had spent nearly 2 years living inside a nightmare of uncertainty and public grief, the verdict represented something that could never undo the loss, but that at least acknowledged the truth of what had happened to a woman and a child who deserved to live. In March of 2005, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, the facility that housed California's death row, situated on the shore of San Francisco Bay. For the next 15 years, that would be his world, a highly restricted environment, characterized by limited movement, controlled interaction, and the particular uncertainty of waiting inside a system where executions had effectively ceased by 2006, and legal appeals stretched across decades without resolution. Then, in August of 2020, the California Supreme Court issued a ruling that changed his legal status in a significant but carefully defined way. The court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence, finding that the trial judge had improperly dismissed jurors during the penalty phase of the trial. The ruling addressed only the punishment. The murder convictions were not overturned. The jury's guilty verdicts remained fully intact. Peterson was still, in the eyes of California law, a convicted murderer. Only the sentence of death was removed. In December of 2021, he was returned to court for resentencing. California prosecutors announced they would not seek the death penalty again. The judge sentenced Peterson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. That phrase carries a precise and permanent legal meaning. There is no future parole hearing. There is no review date. There is no mechanism through which release could ever be requested or granted. The sentence applies for the remainder of his natural life. With the resentencing came a practical question that prison administrators had to answer. Death row inmates lived under one specific set of conditions. A prisoner now classified as serving life without parole fell under different housing and classification protocols. In October of 2022, Scott Peterson was transferred from San Quentin to Mule Creek State Prison, located in Ione, California. That transfer placed him in an environment dramatically different from the isolation of death row. At Mule Creek, inmates in general population housing have opportunities for interaction, shared spaces during meals, recreational programming, and daily social contact with other prisoners. The structure is less restrictive. The environment is less isolated. But there is another dimension to that reality, one that carries its own kind of weight. Scott Peterson entered that facility carrying one of the most widely recognized names in the history of American criminal cases. The Laci Peterson case had been covered in exhaustive detail for years. Documentaries had aired, books had been written, millions of people across the country had followed the trial, formed opinions, and remembered the specifics of what had happened to a young pregnant woman on Christmas Eve in Modesto. In prison, identity matters. Reputation moves through those walls long before a person does. On March 9, 2025, that reality made national headlines again. According to information confirmed by prison officials, Peterson was participating in a recreational pickleball session at Mule Creek State Prison when a physical altercation occurred involving another inmate identified as Charles R. Miles. Correctional staff intervened and used force measures to stop the confrontation. Both men were medically evaluated. Officials confirmed that injuries were considered minor. Neither man required hospitalization. The incident itself was not unusual in the context of a correctional facility. Physical altercations occur in prisons across the country every year. What made this particular incident a national story was the name of the person involved. And the question that emerged immediately was one that prison officials did not fully answer in their public statements. Was Scott Peterson targeted? That question opened into something larger, a broader examination of what daily life actually looks like for one of the most notorious inmates in the California prison system, and what the documented developments of 2025 and 2026 reveal about the reality of living the rest of your life behind those walls. That is exactly where this investigation is going next. She said it was God's plan. 4 words. That was the entirety of the explanation offered by the inmate who had been involved in a physical confrontation with Scott Peterson on March 9, 2025, inside Mule Creek State Prison. No lengthy statement. No detailed account of what had happened on that prison yard. No attempt to reframe the incident into something more nuanced or complicated. Just 4 words that immediately attached themselves to an already widely covered story and ensured that a prison altercation involving one of the most recognized inmates in California became national news before the day was over. But before examining what those words meant, and what the incident itself revealed about the reality of Scott Peterson's daily life, it is worth understanding why that confrontation attracted the level of attention it did. For most people serving time inside a correctional facility, a physical altercation, even one that requires staff intervention, rarely travels beyond the walls of the institution where it occurs. Conflicts happen in prisons across the country every single day. They are documented, processed, and absorbed into the routine of institutional life. The people involved return to their housing units. The incident becomes part of an official record, and the world outside never knows it happened. Scott Peterson is not most prisoners. More than 2 decades after his conviction, his name carries a recognition that follows him into every environment he enters. Every legal filing connected to his case generates media coverage. Every reported development draws public interest. Every incident, no matter how contained, becomes part of a conversation that began in December 2002 and has never fully stopped. According to published reports, the inmate involved in the March 2025 confrontation indicated that he had believed Peterson was approaching him in a threatening manner. The object reportedly at the center of that perception was a pickleball paddle. Authorities documented and processed the event as a use of force incident. Staff had intervened. Both men received medical evaluation. The injuries were confirmed as minor. Peterson returned to his housing unit before the day ended. What the incident did not do was resolve the larger question it had placed back into public view. What does daily life actually look like for Scott Peterson now? What is the lived reality of a man who spent years in one of the most restrictive prison environments in California, and then entered a general population facility where his name was already known by virtually everyone around him? To understand that question fully, it is necessary to understand the difference between where Peterson came from and where he now lives. When he arrived at San Quentin State Prison in 2005, following his death sentence, he entered a world defined by separation. Death row in California was not simply a classification. It was a distinct and deliberate form of confinement. Movement was tightly restricted. Interactions with other inmates were minimal. The structure of each day was governed by protocols created specifically for condemned prisoners. The environment was, by design, isolating. Many people who study the psychology of incarceration have noted that death row can be extraordinarily difficult to endure, not only because of its physical restrictions, but because of the uncertainty it carries. For the years Peterson spent there, California's execution process had effectively ceased. The state's last execution had occurred in 2006. Inmates on death row were living inside a system that had imposed the ultimate punishment but had stopped carrying it out. The result was a form of prolonged suspension, neither the finality of execution nor the possibility of ordinary prison life. Peterson spent more than 15 years inside that environment. Then everything changed. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence. In December 2021, he was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And in October 2022, he was transferred from San Quentin to Mule Creek State Prison in Ione, California. That transfer was not a minor administrative change. It represented a fundamental shift in the structure of his daily existence. Where death row had created distance, physical distance, social distance, a barrier between condemned inmates and the broader prison community, general population housing removed that barrier almost entirely. Meals could take place in shared spaces. Recreation involved contact with other inmates. Daily life included a level of social exposure that death row had not. Some observers of the prison system have noted that this distinction is among the most significant differences a person can experience within the correctional environment. Death row limits interaction. General population increases it. Death row creates separation. General population creates exposure. Neither environment offers freedom. Neither environment is without hardship, but they are fundamentally different forms of incarceration, and the transition between them is not a simple adjustment. For Scott Peterson specifically, that transition carried an additional dimension that most inmates never face. He arrived at Mule Creek, carrying one of the most widely recognized identities in the history of American criminal cases. Many of the inmates already housed there had almost certainly followed his trial years earlier. Some had likely watched television coverage. Others had seen documentaries or read accounts of the evidence. In a world where reputations endure and stories do not disappear simply because time has passed, Peterson's name had preceded him through those gates long before he arrived. The March 2025 confrontation made clear that this reality was not abstract. It had physical consequences. It had documented outcomes, and it placed a spotlight back on a case that millions of people had never stopped discussing. Yet the prison story is only one dimension of what has kept Scott Peterson's name in the headlines in the years since his resentencing. While serving his sentence inside Mule Creek, he has simultaneously been at the center of significant post-conviction legal activity that has generated its own series of developments, rulings, and public debates. In January 2023, the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced that it would represent Peterson in post-conviction proceedings. That announcement drew immediate and substantial national attention. Organizations that focus on wrongful conviction claims devote considerable resources to the cases they choose to accept, and the decision to take on Peterson's case ensured that new legal arguments would receive close examination from courts, journalists, and the public alike. Supporters of the effort viewed the development as meaningful. Critics remained deeply skeptical. But whatever perspective individuals brought to that announcement, the involvement of a major legal organization guaranteed that the case would remain active in the public conversation for years to come. One of the central legal challenges pursued through post-conviction proceedings involved questions about scientific testimony that had been presented during Peterson's original trial in 2004. Attorneys working on the case argued that advances in medical understanding and changes in scientific methodology since the time of the trial warranted a fresh examination of certain conclusions that jurors had heard more than 2 decades earlier. The specific focus of that challenge involved testimony related to fetal development and the timeline surrounding the death of Connor Peterson. The legal argument was that more recent scientific approaches could potentially support different conclusions than those presented to the jury. According to court filings, attorneys asserted that those potential differences could affect how aspects of the prosecution's timeline were evaluated. That argument became one of the most closely watched elements of Peterson's post-conviction litigation, drawing responses from both those who believed the challenge raised legitimate questions and those who argued the conviction had already withstood years of extensive review. Then came a ruling that significantly shaped the current legal landscape. In April 2026, a California judge rejected a petition seeking relief based on those arguments. The decision represented a substantial setback for Peterson's legal team. The ruling did not result in his release. It did not overturn his conviction. It did not alter his sentence. It left him exactly where he had been before the filing, inside Mule Creek State Prison, serving life without the possibility of parole. Attorneys involved in the case indicated their intention to continue pursuing available legal avenues. Additional proceedings remained active. Appeals remained possible. As long as those proceedings continue moving through the court system, the case retains an active legal dimension that runs parallel to the daily reality of prison life. That parallel existence is one of the more unusual aspects of Peterson's current situation. On one side of that reality, legal teams continue constructing arguments, filing documents, and presenting claims to courts. On the other side, daily institutional life proceeds on its own, entirely separate schedule. Meals are served, counts are conducted, schedules are followed, days become weeks, weeks become months. Months accumulate into years. The legal process and the prison routine move forward simultaneously, independent of each other, connected only by the name of the person at the center of both. As of 2026, Scott Peterson is in his 50s. He has spent more than 2 decades in custody. He has moved through multiple phases of the California correctional system, from the restrictive isolation of death row to the documented challenges of general population housing. He has seen a death sentence imposed and then overturned. He has been resentenced. He has been transferred. And he continues pursuing legal remedies while serving a sentence that carries no possibility of release through the parole process. Another issue that has continued drawing attention in the legal proceedings involves allegations related to juror conduct during Peterson's original trial. His legal team has argued that information provided during jury selection deserves additional examination. The central question involves whether certain responses given by a juror during the selection process should have affected that individual's participation in the case. Courts have reviewed aspects of those claims over the years, and legal proceedings related to the matter have continued generating interest among those who follow the case closely. It is important to be clear about what that ongoing litigation means and what it does not mean. A legal filing is not a ruling. An argument presented in court is not a decision reached by a judge. A claim asserted by attorneys is not the same as proof established through evidence. Courts determine whether legal challenges succeed or fail. As of 2026, the conviction remains in place. The sentence remains in place, and Peterson remains incarcerated. What the continued legal activity does mean is that the case has not reached a point of complete finality in every procedural sense. Appeals remain available. Courts continue to receive and evaluate arguments, and as long as that process continues, the case maintains an active legal presence alongside its permanent place in public memory. Outside the walls of Mule Creek State Prison, people continue debating what all of it means. For some, the case represents the functioning of a justice system that investigated a crime, presented evidence to a jury, and reached a verdict that has withstood extensive challenge. For others, it raises questions that remain unresolved, questions about evidence, about procedure, about what the totality of the circumstances actually established. Those debates continue in courtrooms, in media coverage, in documentaries, and in conversations among people who have followed the case for years and people who are encountering it for the first time. What remains unchanged through all of that debate is the most fundamental truth at the center of the story. Laci Peterson is gone. Connor Peterson is gone. A young woman who was 8 months pregnant, who had decorated a nursery and chosen a name for her son, and looked forward to the life ahead of her, disappeared on Christmas Eve in 2002 and was never coming home. That loss does not shift based on legal filings. It does not become more or less significant depending on the outcome of appeals. It remains exactly what it was, an irreversible tragedy that altered the lives of everyone connected to her. That is ultimately why the case continues to resonate more than 2 decades after it began. Not because every question has been neatly answered, not because the legal proceedings have reached a permanent conclusion, but because the story at the center of all of it involved real people, a real loss, and a set of circumstances that the country witnessed in real time and has never fully set aside. The March 2025 prison altercation did not change Scott Peterson's sentence. It did not alter the status of his legal challenges. It did not determine anything about his guilt or innocence. What it did was open a window into the daily reality of a life lived inside a facility where anonymity is not available, where recognition is constant, and where the events of more than 20 years ago follow every moment of every day. Somewhere inside Mule Creek State Prison, that routine continues. The legal battle continues beside it, and the conversation surrounding one of the most documented criminal cases in American history continues in courtrooms, in newsrooms, and among the millions of people who have never stopped asking questions that this case placed before the public long ago. Whether future courts alter the legal trajectory of what comes next remains unknown. Whether new evidence or new arguments produce different outcomes remains unknown. What is known is that this story has not reached its final chapter. The appeals continue, the legal process continues, and the reality of life behind those walls continues, one day at a time, for a man whose name became part of American history and has never stopped carrying that weight. If this investigation gave you the full picture you were looking for, and you want to stay informed as new court decisions emerge and new developments become public in this case and others, make sure to like this video right now and subscribe to DAV Crime Records. Every story on this channel is built on documented facts, investigated with care, and presented with the complete context that major cases deserve. We will be here when the next chapter unfolds.